Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Emily Bichot. I'm going to be interviewing our brilliant guest and star tonight, Sophie Cunningham. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which this event's taking place, and to acknowledge any First Nations people here with us tonight. I humbly and sincerely pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I'd also just like to thank the Wheeler Centre for having us, and also to acknowledge the event partner tonight, which is Melbourne City Reads, and to thank the generous support of George and Rosa Morstan for the Melbourne City Reads program. We also have our wonderful bookseller, the Paperback Bookshop at the back there, waving to us, who will be selling books tonight. Sophie Cunningham is the author of 9 books. Congratulations.
2 of them are very short.
Including City of Trees, a collection of essays that was published in 2019, and Flipper and Finnegan, the true story of how tiny jumpers saved little penguins, great title, which was published a month before this devastating fever, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. She teaches in the Writing a Novel course at the Faber Writing Academy with me. So, welcome, Sophie.
It feels quite weird to have you formally introduce me.
I know.
Working together. But, yeah.
Just to get us started, and for those of us in the audience or maybe listening to the recording later who haven't read the book yet, could you just introduce this devastating fever in your own words?
I said you could ask anything, but that's actually the question that stumps me the most because I don't quite know how to describe it. So it started off as a novel about Leonard Woolf, who was a colonial administrator and then became better known as the husband of Virginia Woolf. And then I introduced, there's a contemporary character who is trying to write a novel about Leonard Woolf, a colonial administrator, and she's finishing that novel during Melbourne's lockdown. So which allowed me to kind of talk about the echoes between the various world-shaking dramas that were happening back then, wars and pandemics, and what we've been going through in recent times.
Great, thank you. So you have worked on this novel for, was it 16 years?
Many years.
Many years.
I mean,
we'll,
I wasn't
we'll keep it at many, sorry.
I didn't work on it the whole time. I did do other things, but I first started playing with the idea when I was on a writer's retreat in Sri Lanka in 2005.
Can you remember what it was that kind of was the spark back then for the novel?
Yeah, it was, to research my time in Sri Lanka, a friend who was from Sri Lanka, the writer Michelle de Kretser, suggested I read Leonard Woolf's diaries of his time there and his autobiography, which is a 6-part autobiography, the part that was written about Sri Lanka, and his novel, The Village in the Jungle. And I did all that reading and he was kind of amazing. Mm-hmm. And partly because he was very modern, I was really struck by how modern, contemporary his voice was and his sensibility was. And I started researching him while I was I kept wanting to know more about him and understand him a bit better, mm-hmm. And didn't really do so much work on the project I was meant to be working on, which I did finish and was published. That was my novel Bird.
Mm-hmm. And so is it kind of the figure of Leonard really that's kept you interested?
Yes, even though as he was very interested in, I suppose, things that I'm interested in. Yeah. And so I do have this slightly strange sense of growing, because it's taken me so long as I have grown older. I was reading Leonard Woolf growing older, and so he sort of became almost like an imaginary friend, to be honest, which is something I riff on a bit in the book. There's a kind of the author's imagined version of Leonard Woolf as separate to the historical version. And I do know that when I was a kid, I did have an imaginary friend called Mr. Nobody. And so in some ways I think Leonard Woolf, and so when, if I stole something out of the pantry, I'd say Mr. Nobody did it. And in some ways I realised that Lud was turning Leonard Woolf into Mr. Nobody.
Can you tell us more about, you said that he was kind of amazing and thinking about things that, you were thinking about now. Can you talk more about that?
Well, two. The way he wrote about the build-up to World War I, which was actually after he'd left Sri Lanka or Ceylon, was really interesting to me, and it sort of captured how we were feeling in the West after the Twin Towers came down, after September 11, that sense of everything changing. And I just got such a strong sense of the repression of the Victorian age and this real excitement that these people, him and other members of the Bloomsbury set had, partly because the Edwardian times were, they were young adults. Edwardian times, they were literally going out dancing and having parties, and that kind of puritanical sense of it being a very puritanical culture, it kind of was lifting, and they were really enjoying that very, very much, creatively, sexually, all the different ways you could, young people enjoy themselves. And then World War I came and just bang, it just all stopped. And he captured that sense of, and it reminded me, I remember when after September 11, you just had that sense everything's going to change now, and indeed it has. Sort of a new era, political era, did really kind of, for the West anyway, I think we entered. So there were kind of lots of times when his description of things would remind me of how I felt about things that were happening in the contemporary world when I was living in the States, which was, I lived there during the campaign, the Trump campaign, and his descriptions of Mussolini was so like Donald Trump. He wrote, and so it just really the whole time I was researching, he consistently, his observations, he wrote a lot about Palestine, he warned about the problems of Israel and Palestine long before... I kept finding that he was very writing about things that we're still talking about today and still not necessarily any closer to resolving. It's not like he solved these things or had anything hugely amazing to say about them, but he observed them and he wrote about them very, very vividly. And the other thing that he did that really struck me was The Village in the Jungle is a extraordinary novel about a village in the jungle, and it's very blunt about human sexuality, but also the main character is a woman of colour, and she's very poor. And I don't think I've read very few English novels that have even attempted to imagine what it's like to be. I mean, I know that can be problematic, but nonetheless, he was attempting to understand what it was like to be, rather than making her the other, he was attempting, giving her a voice. And that's an example, I suppose, of how modern I found his thinking. He's also, I do have to, it sounds like I'm waxing lyrical about him. His second novel, The Wise Virgins, was very bad, and I would like to make sure that no one here ever reads it. So it's not like everything he did was, he could be slightly absurd, which I do kind of write a little bit about as well.
Yeah. Can you talk about how the novel sort of developed over the time that you were working on it?
I'd originally planned to make it a book about his time in Ceylon and his return to England, where he met someone he'd met a couple of times when he was a teenager, and ended up marrying, Virginia Woolf. And then within months of their marriage, she had a massive nervous breakdown. She needed 24-hour care. Sometimes it would take her 6 hours a day to feed her. Because you would probably describe her as anorexic these days. So he didn't necessarily handle it as well as he could have, but he handled it better than a lot of people handled those things at the time. And World War I broke out. So I wanted to try and capture that sense of him having been one person. And he lived very differently in Ceylon. He was a different person. He escaped the English class system temporarily, and he also was top of the heap. I mean, he has probably enacted the class system in some ways, but he was a Jewish man, and that meant that he was not taken as seriously. Well, in England, he didn't have the same human rights, and while there was anti-Semitism, in fact, people used to write about not wanting to be ruled by a Jew. Local people would write that. I think he could distance himself a bit more from it because it was not his culture or something. So he could kind of be himself. So I kind of wanted to write a novel about someone who had attempted to engage with the broader world and then had gone back to England and, you know, had the war and a marriage that was very, very traumatised, and just end it, keep it as a short novel.
So it was a sort of more conventional historical
and it was
novel.
Just really almost, it was a novella.
Yeah.
It was almost like a long short story. And I was going to I was very interested in Dada and various things, so I was going to make it montage. I then was going to do it all using all real material, real diaries, real letters, and try and build the story as a kind of pastiche from, and there's some elements of that still, but apart from anything else, the copyright implications of that would have just, I don't know that I would have had the skill to pull it off, but the copyright implications of that would have been just impossible. It was hard enough getting copyright and expensive enough for what I did use of their real diaries and letters. But one of the things that I did research that period very intensely, and I also became fascinated with the way that as is often the way with these things, his and Virginia's early romance was often on the page, and but also he would tell her stories about his time in Ceylon, so he kind of embroidered that as a way of trying to impress her.
Fascinating.
And he did tell one story about a boy who was drowned by putting stones in his pocket, and I then of course remembered, and Virginia was very interested in this story about the stones in the pocket, and that is in fact how she ended up dying, and she put stones in her own pockets, and in her fiction, characters who are romantically involved say things to each other that are things that she and Leonard said to each other in letters. So I became really interested by the way that their published texts were kind of captured, and their real lives also captured their kind of personal correspondence.
And is that what kind of then led you into sort of bringing in the writer character?
No, the writer character was more. I don't really know what so I did have. I wrote some really great scenes, but just because something's interesting, and just because scenes are well written, doesn't mean you have a novel, really. To my horror, when I realised that, like, how hard can it be? Because it started to feel very static, and like I was just recreating scenes from history which had been written about, because there's so many hundreds or thousands of books have been written, particularly about Virginia. And so then I did a version where it's sort of embarrassing, where instead there wasn't the author, there was a taxidermist who was making these kind of dioramas with Virginia and Leonard in them. And I actually went and looked at human taxidermy when I was in London once to research that. That didn't make the final cut. Where I was trying to kind of make something out of the static nature of how I was recreating history. And then, but really the author did come partly through, I think, desperation.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. And also because I just thought, I just had an idea for how I could make it work, and the pandemic, and I just basically finished it after all those years in 3 months.
Amazing.
Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it is in perfect form. I think it's the perfect novel for now, and I'm glad that you went through all those iterations and came to this.
Well, it certainly taught me that things take the time they need.
Yeah.
And then I'm really pleased that because at each time I thought, I think I've done this, which probably seriously happened twice before the last iterations. And I would show it to people and they'd say, oh, no, not really. And I think when I was a younger writer, I just would have pushed on through and published it anyway, but I thought, well, you know, the world doesn't need another book, doesn't need another book by me, and it certainly doesn't need another book that I know is not good enough by me. So that made it easier to hold off.
Yeah. Well, would you like to share a little section with us?
Yes, and I'll read a little bit in which the first time that Alice kind of shifts from her present, which is researching a novel about Leonard Woolf in Sussex, to the past. On the last day of Alice's walk, she finally moved into a landscape that had not changed for centuries. Emerald green set atop dazzling pure white, chalk cliffs plunging down to pebbled beaches, violet stars, tiny daisies perhaps, growing so it seemed out of the chalk itself, vermilion, white. An undulating series of chalk cliffs billowed along the coast all the way to Eastbourne. She walked up the flanks of the First Sister, then looked across the English Channel. The sense that nothing had changed, the beauty, the height, made her feel vertiginous. This was why she walked. Once Alice's dizziness subsided, she looked down at the rocky beach. There was a pile of clothes lying there on the pebbles. The day was warm, hot even, but the ocean, Alice knew, would be close to freezing. She made her way down to the water, stepping around an old bicycle that had been thrown carelessly to one side of the path. The pile of clothes consisted of an old pair of cords, leather shoes and a plain cotton shirt. A second pile of clothes lay next to the first, a detail she hadn't been able to make out from up high. This pile was stranger. It looked like a uniform of some sort from a vintage costume hire place. Alice considered the channel. It didn't seem as clear as it had from her former vantage point. Rain or perhaps a sea mist was rolling in from France. She loved the idea of that, of weather crossing the channel. In the mist you could see two men. It was hard to make out any details, but they were breaststroking towards each other, calling out as they swum. "It's war," one man shouted, his voice carrying across the water, across the century. The second man stopped swimming, seemed to be treading water. "Are you sure?" he answered, he called before answering his own question. "Of course it is. Expected. Has been since Sarajevo." But still, a shock. "Will you sign up?" Leonard went on to ask the man, for there was no doubt it was him, which meant the other man out there, Alice understood, was the local policeman. Leonard, she knew, had ridden his bike from Ascham to Seaford to bathe the day the war was declared because it was unseasonably hot. He would, Alice also knew, despite the heat, walk between Ascham and Lewes, no small distance, several times over the next few days to get more news about this war with the Germans. "I will, though the force also needs me. You, sir, are you ready to fight?" The conversation carried clearly through time and over distance. Alice's legs gave way. She sat down for a moment, closed her eyes, began to shiver. When she opened her eyes, she seemed to be in an old warehouse in London. I'm not sure if I should. I go into some detail about he's presenting his case to the doctors that he should not have to go and fight in the war, and they asked to see a letter. So he brings them the letter, and so I'm now going to read it, which is a real letter written about him. "I hereby certify that I have this day seen and examined Mr. L.S. Woolf. He first consulted me in March 1914 when I found that he was suffering from marked nerve exhaustion symptoms. He had a general tremor, which I regard as a permanent one, which was most marked in his hands and arms. Sleep was defective and he had severe headaches. He was improved to a certain extent, but the tremor, as I expected, persists and headaches easily come on with fatigue. Owing to his highly nervous state, I have no hesitation in saying that I regard him as quite unfit for military service, and that if he attempts it, he will almost certainly break down within a short time. I may further add that his wife has had several severe mental breakdowns during the last 16 years, and I've been consulted about her on many occasions since 1913. Her husband, Mr. L.S. Woolf, has personally nursed her through these attacks, and she is still in a highly unstable condition if his care is removed. And if his care is removed, I'm of the opinion that the effect will be highly detrimental to her and may bring about a severe mental breakdown. I may add that it is only in cases where I know the personal element to be of such vital importance that I'm willing to express such an opinion to a tribunal. Dr. Maurice Craig." By the time they finished reading, Leonard was so racked with tremors that one of the doctors wondered out loud if he was putting it on, but the others could see he was not. They waved their dismissal, exempt. Alice woke, curled up on the pebbles. Had she been dreaming? It was one thing to have a vivid imagination, but this felt like another thing entirely. Freezing water licked at her feet. There were no swimmers, the clothes had gone, the weather broken, and the mist she'd seen transformed into the storm that was now upon her. She got up, leaned into the wind and kept walking. She had a way to go yet before she reached her destination.
Wonderful.
And that was, I think, partly about the... he was very humiliated by that. He actually wanted to fight in the war, but couldn't. And that also set him apart from Bloomsbury, because most of the Bloomsbury set were pacifists and didn't want to be in the war, but he actually would have fought. He was not a pacifist.
Interesting. I love in that section, which is something you do sort of throughout the novel, the sense of different times kind of coexisting simultaneously, the way that you kind of just ease us into that through that. I think you say he called across space and across the century or whatever. It's beautiful. And there are also parts, as you mentioned, where Leonard and Virginia appear to Alice as kind of ghosts, or in Virginia's case as a sort of skeletal apparition. Yep.
Yes.
Can you talk about this sort of theme of like haunting in the novel, and how sort of doing this research and going to these places and then even just being here, because there are parts where that sort of simultaneity is happening in Melbourne as well, how that sort of changed your thinking about place, if it did?
The ghosts I had slightly less control over. Because a couple of scenes where Leonard just sort of, I ended up writing him into the scene and would think, I think that works. So he's not really a ghost in that scene. It's more that she's seeing something that really did happen. He really did, walk down there and was swimming, and the local policeman told him that there was a war. And then I had a scene where he was obsessed with record keeping. And Alice, the author, is always trying to work out if she'll ever make money from writing her novel. And so he occasionally would appear and talk about the sales figures of his and Virginia's books and how much they did or didn't make and whatever. But that was it, really. And then and it wasn't quite enough to make the idea work. It was sort of a flourish, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. But then when I was in Bloomington, Indiana, which is more recent, that was in 2018, I think, I don't mean that I actually started talking to Virginia, but the day I arrived there, my father died, which was, was a shock. Well, he was sick. Anyway, he died. And so that's a kind of strange headspace to be in when you're alone for some months, sitting in a Midwestern town in a library. And so I suppose I was in a slightly morbid frame of mind. And I was reading lots of letters by Vita Sackville-West, in which she would describe her passion for Virginia to her husband. And I found myself reading those letters in a slightly pervy way, and I started to just feel a bit gross, because it was not even really relevant to the book. It was just like, when are they going to get together? So, and the absurdity of that, I just suddenly imagined Virginia saying, "What are you doing?" And being very irritated. And she, in general, was very irritated by people trying to put any labels on her. And I was very aware that so much of what I'd been reading about her were people's theories about Virginia.
Yeah.
That she wasn't breastfed enough, and that's one of the reasons why she had nervous exhaustion, or 6 weeks, for those who are wondering, which is exactly the amount of time that I was breastfed for. So maybe that's part of my connection with that story. Was she a lesbian? Wasn't she a lesbian? It's just everyone's theories, and she used to hate that stuff. And when journalists, when she was famous enough to be of interest to the media, they would sometimes find journalists in the garden trying to look in their back windows and stuff, and she used to really... So that character, I started to have fun, and I just realised I needed to have more fun with the material, that it wasn't an academic book, it wasn't a history book, that most of this material was in the public domain, and that I should just relax and let myself have a bit more fun with it. And so I didn't really... Then I just sort of wrote the ghosts without overly thinking through why or what they were doing. I sort of let that be a slightly less conscious process of part of the writing process. I certainly wasn't, to be honest, thinking about the pandemic and because all those kind of things. The ghost did come before the pandemic.
Yeah, but it works so well just as a sort of literalisation of that feeling of, you know, the past being present, you know, particularly in these places that you inhabit so beautifully in the...
And it also actually, one thing that it does, which I'm really pleased it did, but a friend of mine commented on this and I was really grateful she did, but I really didn't want Virginia to be a victim. And when I talked about that kind of reading things in a pervy way, there was partly a slightly kind of reading a lot about her suicide as well. That is kind of taking particular tropes or cliches about this is what her life was like and that how reductive that was. I'm totally blank as about the point I was going to make. What was I saying?
about the past being...
Yeah.
present.
Sorry, I can't remember now.
Oh, well.
It'll come back to me.
We can move.
That's right. I really the ghost allowed her to have a kind of to be alive. She's alive for the whole book.
Yeah.
So even though the character the fictional historical version dies, she continues to be a very lively presence through the book, as does Leonard. Well, less
and she's
lively,
obviously continued her reading as well. Which
she continues to read. She's read The Argonauts has views on the whole LGBTIQ situation.
So good. Something that I really noticed in the book was that there's a lot of sort of astrological symbolism. So there's like the comet, there's a blood moon, there's a meteor shower. There's lots of kind of moments when characters are sort of looking at the night sky. And I guess my reading of that, or what it kind of, the impact on me as a reader was it sort of pulled me out of the, you know, the drama, or often actually the kind of real sadness of what was happening in the human realm of the story, and into a kind of sense of, you know, a different time scale, or sort of
I'm glad that
deep time or something.
That was part of this. That's what I was trying to do. I'm very pleased. But I also do love that stuff. And Leonard Woolf did write an amazing series of passages in his diaries about seeing Halley's Comet back in 1908, or 1909. And it was much more dramatic. Like you could see it in the daytime. The tail hung very heavily in the sky, and people thought it was a bit like Y2K. People thought that the Earth was going to go through the tail of the comet, and everyone was going to die or something. I can't even remember now what, but it was just kind of crazy stuff. So that partly reminded me of Y2K, but of when I tried to see Halley's Comet when I was like 19, and it was in the 80s, and my boyfriend at the time and I had a joint, and then was looking through binoculars going, is that it? No, I can see it, and became convinced we could see it, but we never saw it. I mean, no one saw it. It was almost impossible to see when it came back in the 80s, and that was very disappointing, because I knew that that was going to be my only chance, unless I lived till I was about 120 or something. But I did also finish writing this book when when my wife and I were living in Mount Macedon, and the night skies there are amazing. So there was quite a lot of, and we were in lockdown. So there was quite not an inconsiderable amount of time spent. There was that amazing eclipse. There was the earthquake, which was frankly the highlight of the whole pandemic. That was such great. And there was also, and this happened towards the very end of writing it, but I did see Venus scintillating.
What?
It was amazing. Well, the star was rising, but it was looking. I could see red, like flashes of blue and red and green, and I just thought it was my eyesight's getting really bad. which it is. And but then I looked on the internet and they said, yes, that at certain times of year, certain angles, whatever, Venus scintillates. And that's where the word scintillating comes from. So, you know,
Wow.
I mean, lots of little, so lots of, but it does, I mean, I did find those things, I do find those things do help you get perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, especially that sort of sense of, you know, there have been many, many times in the past when people have thought they were living in end times, the end of civilization, and it keeps going.
Yes,
at least
and,
until now. Who knows?
Yeah, no, and I have a planets app. You know, I wander around with my planets app and point out planets. I think that we should move on.
I wanted to ask you about form in this book, because you really kind of play with form in really, I think, exciting ways here. And I guess the fact that you've brought in this writer figure makes it become a book about writing itself. But I think also, particularly because of the subject matter, there's a really deep thinking through of the novel and its relationship with imperialism, particularly. And at one point, Ghost Leonard visits Alice and says, "I have come to discuss the future of the novel with you. You are aware, yes, that the kind of novel you've been trying to write is a product of our imperial culture. Virginia had the skills to try and present a new vision in her work, and I've been shocked to learn that literary fashion has returned to the Victorian model after all we did to break free of it." Can you talk a bit about like the thinking that you did about the novel as a form while you were writing this?
Well, one thing I'd say in that sort of recurring little moments in the book is that she's teaching. And I'm pretty sure that there are a couple of writing a novel students here, and I don't know what do I call it? How to write? I call it something similar in the book. T with the trademark. I have really enjoyed teaching because it makes you think about those things rather than just take them for granted, and so. I have increasingly over the years found myself thinking not what even is a novel, but what even is narrative. And I first started thinking about that when I was writing City of Trees, really. And it really was this kind of felt profound for me at the time, was when I was caring for my dad when he had quite advanced dementia. I could always tell his stories weren't connected to narrative in the way that we think of them, you know, the way you think of narrative. So he would the stories would half start all over the place, and so it was fragmenting. The narrative we all tell about ourselves, this was all fragmenting. And I found that really interesting because he never stopped being himself on some essential level. And I knew him well enough to know where the different stories were coming from. And it did make me start to think about, well, what is a story anyway, and what stories do we tell about ourselves? So I was thinking quite a lot about that, and that's partly the reason why that was going to be even more discontinuous. Those essays were kind of an attempt to kind of mess up narrative flow or narrative structure. But also the fiction, non-fiction thing just started to kind of... I started to really struggle with because it was so hard, but I had set myself this task. But writing fiction about people that so much has been written about, how do you really write fiction about them? Isn't it just non-fiction? What is, you know? So I was thinking about that for the whole project. But then towards the very end, I did just really find myself. There's something neat and resolved about novels, and that doesn't relate to lives, and I just started to think about how that fits into the, systems of colonialism, any kind of story, any kind of culture where you're very anxious to repress certain parts of history and build up sort of heroes or build up kind of other kind of hero narratives anyway, is partly about repression. And so I kind of whereas Augustan novels are much more kind of all over the place in ways that are quite, which are the first, when novels first started being written. I did do, back in the 80s, did some of this stuff at uni. And they were kind of chaotic, and they weren't really novels as we think of them today. And I actually realised I preferred them, really. It's more. I do think that writing should be fun, and there's something very serious about some novels, and so I did want to kind of just like, they should be fun to read and fun to do. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure what the point is.
Yeah.
I don't mean it can't be serious, but the process of creation itself, it's not torture, and it's not like a sitting an exam and getting it exactly right. It shouldn't feel like that.
So this kind of fractured form or discontinuous kind of form feels more sort of true to...
It feels more true to me.
Yeah.
But also the other thing that happened, so not all the different kind of ideas that I'm raising in the novel are kind of fully resolved, but when I was in Macedon, it was such a colonial space. It's very beautiful, but I was surrounded by oaks. There were a lot of kangaroos, and there were a lot of eucalypts further away from where we were living. We had lots of oaks around. There were foxes, there was stag. And I suddenly thought, I feel like I'm in Kew Gardens, which was a place I really love, but it's very English kind of. And I just started to think about how much of the way I live my life as a settler Australian is in fact English, a kind of putting English, transplanting of English behaviours onto this land, and indeed onto the way we tell stories and those kind of things. There was something about the physical landscape at Macedon that was making me think about it. Because then just up the hill you had Mount Macedon and there were a couple of sort of big old volcanic rock formations, or Hanging Rock famously being one of them. And time in those places does feel different, partly because they're such amazingly old formations, and that was so different to that kind of more curated, the curated gardens which that place is famous for. I do find that the kind of physical landscapes I'm in have a big effect on my work.
Can you talk more about that?
Well, I suppose that's... that I don't find that I think through things like the novel, for example. I don't necessarily do my best thinking when I'm reading about something. It's more that it sort of happens the best thinking happens out of the corner of your eye when you're doing something else.
Yeah.
And for me, that's often walking. Occasionally, occasionally it has been gardening as well, but kind of being physically active, and you're kind of thinking away, and so that somehow means that the physical activity somehow kind of gets involved in the creative process in a way that I can't quite explain. Yeah. I mean, originally, The City of Trees, which ended up being a book about trees, was originally going to be a walking book, but then I realised that there had been a wave of hundreds of walking books, and I'd missed that particular boat, so to speak. I find if I'm staring something in the face, a problem, writing any kind of issue, I don't necessarily solve it, but somehow just being somewhere and thinking about other things and looking at other things does help me solve problems. But it means you have to be really literal. I mean, I find, like, so with my this book I walked, I mean, it was quite hard, but no, I walked the South Downs Way, which helped me create a lot of that kind of material set in Sussex, and was a really important way of me trying to understand Leonard and Virginia, who did spend so much of their life walking. In fact, in general, the English, even the really ones that were meant to be unhealthy and had bad asthma, would still walk 20 miles in a day and kind of treat it quite differently. But with Bird, I did a trek in the Himalayas, which was really not hugely relevant to the book, but so I call a lot of the kind of physical activity I kind of think of as research, though it's a bit of a stretch.
That's interesting. Well, I'd really like to talk to you about how you sort of translated all of the sort of material and the archival research that you did into the actual sort of scenes that appear in the book, particularly in the parts of the novel where you inhabit the characters of Leonard and Virginia, as sort of fully fleshed people. There are, scenes containing dialogue and their inner thoughts, and I found myself really wondering while I was reading it how you kind of constructed those. So I was just wondering if you could maybe just read a little bit for us from page 148 to just give a taste of this, and then maybe kind of talk us through the process of constructing these scenes.
Okay, well, this is a scene when I referred to, when Virginia was she had two distinct phases to her breakdown, which went for about 3 years. And in one of them she was very voluble, and one of them she didn't say anything. So this was the phase where she was talking more. Mm-hmm. Husband and wife sat in silence for a moment before Leonard said, "The doctors and I are in agreement. We must abandon thoughts of children immediately." "This is not your decision to make," Virginia said. Her relative calm belied the violence she heard in his words. Leonard's tusks had gored her, were tearing her innards out. She began to shake uncontrollably from head to toe. Sometimes the two of them went hours together like this, two trembling animals on the point of extinction. It got worse. Virginia began to keen in a long, high-pitched moan, reminding Leonard for a moment of women from the village, more animal than human. "You are murdering me." "You are being overly dramatic. You don't like children," Leonard countered. "I love my nephews. I would love my own children. It is the children of strangers who get on my nerves. It is you," Virginia's voice was rising to the occasion, "who does not like children." "I like children very much," Leonard said stiffly. "One thing I regret in not being a woman is that I can't bear children. It is perhaps the world we would bring them into about which I have my doubts. I don't think you know the terrible things that can happen to a child. Losing a mother at 13 isn't a terrible thing. A half-sister at 15, a father at 19, and a brother who was only 26 when he died. Do I not have a half-sister locked away somewhere in a madhouse?" Now she thought to mention it. "Tragedy has haunted my family, yet you talk to me as a woman who knows nothing of the world." Virginia, he thought that life was something she could not see, that she could not understand the meanness and sordidness of it. But what was her illness, if not something mean and sordid? It reduced her. "I did not mean to suggest. You poisoned things." Virginia turned away from him, unable to look into his mournful, anxious face for a moment longer.
Thank you. So, can you talk to us about how you went about constructing scenes like that? So did you sort of draw on letters and diaries to kind of
there was
know
a lot written about the decision to have children because, and it was quite a, it was an important scene for me to write. I mean, not just because it's important to Leonard and Virginia, but because I think when I first started writing the novel, I was like on Team Leonard, and I wasn't necessarily fully engaging with the ways in which he did behave very badly. And it's not going to be a real novel if I don't really engage with that. And a lot has been her breakdown, the more serious, soon after that conversation she tries to commit suicide for the first time when they're together. And a lot's been, and in his biography Leonard wrote about how they made the decision to have children together, not to have children together as a couple, but that's in fact not true. He went to a series of doctors until he went to about 8 doctors until one doctor said, "Oh, I don't think it would be very good for any." He said, See, I've got a certificate or whatever. So he was just being very authoritarian and trying to impose himself upon her. So I really tried to imagine, and because her mental health was so kind of chaotic, people probably people did patronise her and wouldn't let her make decisions. And so I suppose I just found... So I put together lots of those kind of complicated feelings, I suppose. And,
And did she write about...
No, that she didn't. And she did, in fact... I think the thing about children was difficult for her because she... it was difficult for them because she didn't actually want to have... I hate to get overly technical, sexual intercourse with Leonard. So part of the issue was, how do we even get pregnant? And she'd started to say, everyone just assumed, I think it was part of the whole thing was just assumed that they would have children, and Leonard actually understandably didn't know that she would be able to manage to have kids. She was in her mid-30s, they'd married quite late. And so you understood to some extent where he was coming from, but I think she just always assumed she would have children. But in later life, she did actually express a certain relief that she didn't have children, or that they hadn't had children. However, she and Leonard were both incredibly close to Vanessa's, to their nieces and nephews, and played quite some role in their parenting. So they did have a relationship, close relationships, 2 children, but she did seem to, I think, understand that it gave her the freedom to write.
Yeah.
And really what she wanted to be was a writer. That's really all she really wanted to do.
Yeah.
So she probably would have ended up agreeing with him, but it was more the method of by which he chose to pass on the information. It's a done deal. But it is, in general, the whole process of this novel is weird in that it took, I worked on it for a very long time, and so it sounds as if there was a huge amount of conscious, but it's a bit like you lay the ground, you do a huge amount of reading, and then you just kind of write the scenes sort of almost over there, and at a certain point you have to stop referring to the notes and just write the scene as you would write a scene.
Yeah.
And allow yourself to kind of connect to the emotional force of the scene.
So that conversation essentially you made up knowing the reality, but not
totally
directly based on...
But it was also as a scene where I realised that in earlier versions of the novel I had written her much more as a victim, kind of being totally passive, and she was part of what was important in that really was her insisting that she did have some position and that she couldn't just be walked over.
Well, shortly we are going to open up for questions, so I'm just going to put that out there so that you can start thinking about what you would like to ask Sophie yourselves. But just another question from me. So you obviously spent a lot of time researching this novel, and there's a lot of praise of librarians in the novel, which I love. In fact, you made Alice's wife a librarian, which is excellent. And at one point you write, Alice would find herself wondering about the archives of the future when, rather than the expansive letters she spent her days reading, there would be, at best, these stray assortments of fragmented messages and, at worst, no trace left at all. And it really made me think, about that, the future of the archive. And I was wondering whether this has sort of made you think differently about, your own archive, the way that you treat things like messages and emails.
It has at different times. You have a whole lot but there's a lot of crap in text messages which you possibly wouldn't write. That was great, lol. Whatever. I don't say lol anymore, but
Sell
I did
it to the state library
in earlier messages. I did, but I used to write a lot of letters, and actually I have put those into some of those, if the ones that are relevant to my creative or my work as a publisher are in the National Library already. So I had started to organise things, and that had several, partly because of the space, to be honest. It's not that I was desperate to, but you actually have to ask permission, and you have to make decisions about when people can read things and all that kind of stuff. So I did start to think about all that, and then I suppose over the years I thought, because I think the line in the you just read about worst of all, left with no traces at all, that doesn't actually seem to be so terrible now, I have to say. I'm not sure that, but I do try and keep track of things digitally, and try and, I've been talking to people about trying to rescue a whole lot of, really interesting stuff from my early days at McPhee Gribble, which was in the late 80s, which is on floppy disks, and trying to get that material out. But what with things as they are today, I'm just really not. Also because weirdly this came up when I was having a kind of a conversation with some friends about stuff we shouldn't have, they were sort of like gossip. And it was all on WhatsApp, and I had to actually say to one of my friends, you're just acting as if this is a totally private space, but I think that's very naive. I do think that the digital form is not a totally private
this is the
space.
And so, future.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I do think about my communications, I suppose, in general. But, and I used to print out my manuscripts and do things by hand and keep them. But frankly, libraries don't want that stuff anymore because there are too many, unless you, I don't know, win the Booker or something, there's like, they don't need a whole lot of like versions of my second novel with a few proofreading marks on it. There's not storage space. I mean, so in general, I think libraries are struggling to maintain the space for archives, and so that was actually something that with my biological father died, was having to be dealt with when people were dealing with his archives, and I've also helped someone else with their archives. So yeah, I do. It's hard to know because I think we like to think that everything is precious. But it's only precious to a very limited number of people. So Leonard Woolf's archives are amazing because he would write on a little kind of decks of cards every piece of music that he and Virginia listened to, whether they like classical music and kind of what they listened to on different nights so that they could keep track of what they were listening to. He used to breed dogs and cats, and he kept all the breeding certificates. And I had wanted to kind of write a whole lot of, he was very into his animals, and I thought I could do some amazing research because there was a big box which was dogs and cats, and I thought, there's going to be some lovely stuff here, but it was just like endless weird breeding certificates about who is going to mate his spaniel with. Kind of like, so it's sort of, so look, that was interesting to me, but there's only so much space in the world, so I don't quite know what I think about archives anymore, quite how like with photos, it's the same issue really. There's now millions and millions of photos in the public sphere, and how does one work out which are worth keeping? And I find it interesting to think about, but I don't have I haven't landed anywhere with it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is really fascinating though. I mean, even just hearing you talk about the different iterations of this novel and how in a way you've kind of found ways to weave.
I have kept track of all the earliest drafts. I don't print it out anymore. But I do keep track of different drafts. Partly because it's useful. Also, you suddenly remember a scene you wrote 10 years ago and think, I need that scene back and go back into it. So I am fairly diligent about that kind of stuff. But then you lose lots of things. I mean, something goes wrong and you lose bits and pieces. You get a new computer and you fail to move everything across. Yeah. But I also remember before we moved to America, I had thousands of books, which are books I'd worked through my work in the publishing industry, and it was like I can never get rid of them. But it was like insane unless you could live in a house that had a library about this size. Like, what was I going to do with them? And I ended up giving them to libraries, giving them to friends, leaving some of them outside in boxes, and people could pick them up, and I felt great. Did actually, I kind of thought, I felt like I've been dragging the past around with me, and actually I didn't really need my copy of, Great Expectations from when I was at Monash Uni in 84. It's just stuff. So I have, in fact, I used to think that archives were really important, and now I just think, it's just small stuff. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think you couldn't have written this book without the archives of the past, and it's just really interesting to think about, I think. And you do think about it in the book, which is a really interesting part of the narrative. Well, let's open up for questions. We have a couple of microphones, so if you have a question, just wait until you get handed one of those.
And if you don't, Emily and I can,
Keep nattering.
Keep nattering.
We have one at the front. Can you just raise your hand a little bit more?
I've like 10 pages from the end of the book, so no spoilers, please. But
The pandemic doesn't end. I'm sorry, I spoiled it for you.
Yeah, I've got my mask in my hand. I have to say how much I really appreciated the footnotes through the book, and I just wondered if you could talk a bit about your decision with using them.
Yeah, that was partly because I was learning, because of all the research I did, a lot of it which was totally not relevant. Well, so not relevant to the book in its final form, but I couldn't kind of quite let go of wanting to share the details. So almost in a kind of very casual, without really thinking it through, I just thought, I'm going to throw in some footnotes and see how they work. And then someone read it and didn't think they worked. And I thought, oh no, I think they're right. I don't think they work, and I removed them. And then, but someone else who then read the next version said, oh no, you shouldn't have lost the footnotes. I loved them, and so I actually I ended up with a lot more of them. In general, I found that, say, with the ghosts or with the footnotes, with things that are little ideas I'm playing with, I sometimes was a bit tentative, and so it wasn't quite clear what the point of them was, so I actually ended up leaning in harder to the footnotes. And I was really grateful I did that, particularly towards the end when writing about Louis Everett, who worked with the Woolfs for 30 years, and there was no way I could in a natural way incorporate all this information about her history, but she was such an important part of their lives. She was there the day Virginia died, she was there the day Leonard died. And so, being able to add footnotes, at least making it clear that these people were also really worthy of attention, was something I really enjoyed. And then I remembered, that the fad for novels that had lots of footnotes, and David Foster Wallace being an obvious one, and decided to just, really go for it. But
and I love how you say, Alice did a lot of research about this and then failed to incorporate it in any meaningful way into the novel.
Well, because towards the end, I really wanted to have a lot more about Maynard Keynes, partly because his work as an economist was so crucial to the modern world during the pandemic, and a lot of his theories came back, and indeed he's writing about the Spanish flu, and his descriptions of the impact it was having on people he knew was effectively like this amazing kind of testimonial stuff about which reminded me of people talking about long COVID. His work is so interesting, and he is so interesting, but there was just, it was already taken 16 years. I was not going to go. So he's an example of a character I did a lot of research in, and actually just ended up removing the scenes because there was no.
The next novel.
Yeah, no, I'm not going back. I'm not going back to Maynard.
No, you're not.
He's on his own. Yeah.
Another question. Come on. I have more, but
you can just ask me another one, Em.
We have another one.
Is this on? Yeah, thanks guys for a lovely chat. I was just wanting to know what Virginia's feeling towards Leonard's work was.
She was very, that's a good question, because she was very gentle about the fact that he could be quite bad. And she also, so with The Wise Virgins, which was a very bad novel and was kind of awful to her, really, because it was about a man who could have gone out with two different women, one of whom was a real goer and one of them who wasn't. And it was very obvious what that was all about. And he gave it to her to read when she was breaking down. And the breakdown got worse.
Great guy.
Yeah. And what do you think of my book? And she wrote quite nice things about it in the diary, and was very considered. And towards his political work, she actually really rated. And, she thought he was a fine thinker. But I think his creative work, she could tell that he wasn't great, and she had to be fairly gentle with him. So The Village in the Jungle is weird, because that is a really good creative work, but he didn't really replicate that. Also, she became so good, he just stopped trying to do that kind of work. He wrote some short stories, and at a certain point he thought, I'm going to write non-fiction. I can't compete with her, because it was just clear to him. He really did think she was a genius, and so I think he just stepped aside, really.
It is a really interesting thing about their relationship, because it sort of inverts that cliche of the masculine genius with the supportive wife in the background enabling him to work, because, Virginia could do what she did in a way because she had Leonard.
And after she died, he took very seriously the job of preserving her memory and, and spoke to anyone who was researching PhDs or doing anything. He would spoke to people constantly. He did a lot of work to kind of maintain her reputation, and there was a period when a lot of people were dismissing her work. I mean, that these writers go in and out of fashion, and he would always defend her to the end. This is all despite the fact that he did, and another one of the slightly brutal truths I had to wrap my head around when I was writing this, about 18 months after Virginia died, he fell in love with someone else and was with her for 30 years, even though that was also complicated because she was married to someone else. And anyway, the English get up to all kinds of things. But nonetheless, he did give his heart to another, but he remained a loyal custodian of her work. And a lot of people hold that against him, actually, because he did try and, I suppose, filter the perception of her. So when Vita Sackville-West wanted to, in the 50s, I think, wanted to put out a book of their correspondence, their erotic correspondence, he refused to give her, he came up with a whole lot of reasons why that wasn't going to be possible. But clearly it was just he didn't really want that. He was just upset. Didn't really want it out there. So he didn't always manage to just be a kind of objective, custodian of her memory.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I believe that we are out of time.
4 noughts. Time's up.
Time's up, the screen just said. But please buy copies of this brilliant, wonderful, moving, just all-round incredible work.
Emily, thank you. You've been very lovely.
Sophie will happily sign for you. If you do think of another question that you would like to ask her, she'll be sitting back there. And please join me in thanking Sophie for joining us.